Fidel Castro says Cuba's revolution is not capitalistic nor communist, but Cuban. In any event, it is emotional. The Song of Revolution is only one of many weapons used to stir the spirit of nationalism in Cuba. It has echoed through Cuba since July 26, 1953, for it was on that date that Fidel Castro led a suicide attack on the Fort Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, the opening shots in the successful war against Fulgencio Batista. I'm Wayne Ferris. This is Fidel Castro. With or without portfolio, he's Cuba's strong man. He's her weakness. Fidel Castro has ruled 6 months, 26 days. Tonight, we examine Cuba's progress since the fall of Batista on January 1st. In this, we may find the key to her future. Fidel Castro fancies himself as a Cuban Robin Hood. By taking from the rich and giving to the poor, Castro expects to solve Cuba's deteriorating economy. As a result, Cuba's wealthy supporters are disenchanted. The middle class is questioning. Castro's strength is clearly in the masses who have nothing. The campesinos, the tenant farmer, who he has given hope. At best, we can label the Castro government a disorganized popular dictatorship. Is Fidel Castro a communist? Possibly. Certainly he is a left-wing liberal. Castro has no patience with opposition. It's easier to denounce them as traitors and counter-revolutionaries. But Fidel is egotistical. When the sniping gets rough, he's like a little boy who seeks his mother for comfort. In this respect, Fidel Castro has hundreds of thousands of little mothers. Less than 10 days ago, he took his troubles to the people. Fidel Castro resigned as prime minister. He had been hurt by what he termed the treacherous words of Pedro Diaz-Lanz, defected Cuban Air Force chief, and capitalistic, treacherous attitude of President Manuel Urrutia. Both had lashed out at communists in the Cuban government. Castro's resignation caught the people by surprise. All Cuba was calm. Political maneuver that Fidel would not walk out on the people. By mid-afternoon, the move to retain Castro was underway and well organized. Students rallied at the University of Havana, the traditional hotbed of politics. Castro supporters took to the streets with placards urging Fidel to reconsider. By nightfall, all Cuba was alert for another Castro telethon. Troops lined the streets surrounding Havana's CM. Urrutia lost favor with Castro after accusing the communists of doing horrible damage to his country, and a communist newspaper of serving as a Soviet instrument leader in the city of Guantanamo. We asked Almeida why Diaz-Lanz was fired.
Ya deseo de hablar más de este señor, pero voy a decir que fue echado de aquí por el nepotismo que tenía en la aviación cubana. No es justo que un cuerpo que es para la integridad nacional la usufructen 4 o 5 parientes, menospreciando el prestigio, las cualidades revolucionarias de los demás pilotos. Me han traído aquí, sin ser yo piloto, para reestructurar el cuerpo. Lo estoy haciendo asesorándome de valores positivos que tenía la aviación y que habían sido echadas a un lado por el jefe de puesto.
Major Almeida has given his interpretation on the Diaz-Lanz matter and the certainty that this man was not fired from the Air Force. Rather than that, he was only accused of his nepotism, which in the time that the Cuban Revolution is facing would not be tolerated. He was not rather fired from the Air Force, he deserted, and at this time we cannot allow things of such a nature to occur within our national crisis.
The major had a little difficulty deciding whether Diaz was a good soldier.
no fue un buen soldado porque no supo, como era debido, representar a su país. Sí puedo decir que es un buen piloto. Cuando el proceso revolucionario servía de enlace entre nosotros y el exterior, y armas trajo de afuera para nosotros. Eso en justicia hay que reconocerlo.
Major Diaz-Lance was not considered a good soldier because he did not know how to represent his country properly. His merits as a revolutionary are recognized because he was liaison between the movement, revolutionary movement in the foreign, and Cuba by bringing a lot of arms and ammunition to the forces of Dr. Fidel Castro. Within all justice, this is very much recognized in the sense that he was also an excellent pilot.
We inquired, too, about a possible attack by the Cuban Air Force on the Dominican Republic.
Bajo ninguna circunstancia, Cuba atacaría a ningún país. La aviación de Cuba está para defender la integridad nacional, no para atacar. Nosotros siempre estaremos aquí a la defensiva.
Under no circumstances would the Cuban Air Force attack any foreign country or friendly country. This Air Force is here to defend the national integrity and the rights of the people.
The Air Force, Diaz replied with tongue-in-cheek.
Batista, Trujillo y el senador Island, creo que la isla está llena de comunistas.
Within the statements and opinions of Trujillo, Batista, and Senator James E. Eastland of the United States, yes, this island is full of communism.
Yet Del Pino, who had worked closely with Castro in plotting against Batista, split with the revolutionary leader over communist infiltration. Del Pino has since been operating against Castro out of Miami. Cuban police seized Del Pino as he attempted to fly a group of Cubans to the United States. It has been denied that Raul Castro, Fidel's kid brother, is a communist. Big Brother would perhaps do well to consider Raul's associates. Raul Castro is outspoken, yet he remains in the shadow of his glib-tongued brother, a shadow from which he obviously would like to emerge and grow. Fidel had trouble with Raul in the mountains. Now, as commander of Cuba's armed forces, Raul Castro could be the most dangerous man to the nation's internal security. His troops reportedly are communist indoctrinated. The white star of Cuba is painted red on many military vehicles. Significant, perhaps, of Raul Castro's anti-American feeling was an incident reported by WCKT's news director Gene Strull, who watched Raul reject a cigarette because it was American-made. It was more than a thinking man's gesture, for Raul has boasted that Cuba can get along without the United States. Raul is perhaps happiest when his troops are enforcing land seizures under the Agrarian Reform Program. There's no doubt that Cuba's peasants live a frugal existence under impossible conditions. Few deny that a more equitable distribution of land is necessary and that the farmers need help. Castro's Agrarian Reform Program is looked upon as their salvation. Anything over 3,500 acres is claimed by the government for the campesinos, many of whom fear the responsibility thrust upon them. Cattlemen claim they cannot operate in the restricted acreage. Castro says they're counter-revolutionary. The Agrarian Reform Institute says all land seized are paid for with bonds maturing in 20 years. Those challenging the legality of the seizure will probably not be around to redeem them. Castro's desire to give the machete-swinging campesino a farm of his own could backfire in economic collapse. The farmer has been promised he would soon move from a crude thatched hut to a modern ranch-type home with a tractor in the front yard. But Castro doesn't say where the money will come from, who will pay for the gasoline, who will instruct the campesino in the use of farm equipment, nor does the farmer ask whether he will be given the deed to his newfound land. Without the deed, the campesino has merely become a tenant of the state, another cog in the socialistic wheel. Good goes to church on Sunday, but the habaneros agree that laughter has returned to Havana. There's no longer silence when a policeman approaches. No longer do the police demand tribute from the taxi drivers and shopkeepers. They're courteous and helpful to tourists. Fidel is teaching of English in the schools will be curtailed, but there's no confirmation. Castro is concentrating on rural schools, while in the mountains, his troops volunteered for classroom duty in shacks and hovels called schools. As for the press, it's free, but it rarely finds fault with Fidel. Castro's mouthpiece is Revolution. Its director, Carlos Franchi, doesn't like Americans. WCKT newsmen asked Franchi if Revolution is a communist organ.
La Revolución es un periódico independiente. Es el órgano del 26 de julio y la expresión de su revolución humanista. Una revolución que lucha por la consagración de la libertad, de los derechos individuales y por la satisfacción material de todas las necesidades del hombre. Una revolución que, como ha definido nuestro líder Fidel Castro, no está ni a la izquierda ni a la derecha, sino un paso más hacia adelante. Una revolución que está con el hombre, que está por el pan sin terror y por la libertad con pan. En cuanto a mí, pienso independientemente. No soy comunista. Uno responde un poco con esa sonrisa a este tipo de preguntas, que parece una pregunta de policía. Recuerdo que cuando el asesino Mariano Fajek, uno de los jefes de policía de Batista, me detuvo en la época que luchábamos contra la tiranía, esa fue una de las primeras preguntas también. Parece que los que tenemos pensamiento independiente, los que estamos en América por la libertad, se nos acusa siempre por los dictadores de comunistas. Y después, repitiendo el eco de esas acusaciones, mucha gente calumniosamente sigue repitiendo esa acusación.
Revolution is a free paper, is the official organ of the movement 26th of July, and the expression of the people. The expression of this revolution that's struggling to consecrate the liberty and the individual rights of man together with its necessities. This revolution is not to the left or to the right. It's just one step in front. This revolution fights for the man and for covering his necessities, for giving freedom with bread and bread without terror. In regards with me, I think independently. I am not a communist, and when I answer to this question, I answer it with a smile when such questions are asked. I remember once when I was kept in detention by Mariano Fayette, that was one of the criminals of the last tyranny, that this was the first question he asked me. And I see that some people are repeating it continually as the dictators who, all those that seem to think freely, are considered as communists or at least accused as such things.
Franchi then volunteered reasons he blamed for poor relations between the United States and Cuba.
Voy a poner un ejemplo al pueblo norteamericano de por qué nuestras relaciones no están mejor. El ejemplo es esta entrevista misma. Véase cómo todas las preguntas han girado sobre temas negativos. No se ha preguntado nada positivo. No se ha hablado de la transformación que ha habido en Cuba, de que en Cuba se ha acabado el juego, de que en Cuba se ha acabado el robo, de que en Cuba hay una entera libertad, de que en Cuba no hay crímenes, de que en Cuba no hay dictadura, de que en Cuba el pueblo tiene un nivel de vida muy superior, de que en Cuba se está haciendo una profunda reforma agraria para darle a los hombres que viven en el campo la posibilidad de trabajar y de vivir decentemente. ninguna de la profunda transformación realizada por el gobierno revolucionario ha sido mencionada en esta entrevista porque todo el cuestionario giraba sobre aspectos negativos.
I am going to give an example to the North American people of why our relations are not improved. The example is this same interview. See how all the questions have rounded negative things. Nothing positive has been asked. We have not spoken of transformation that has taken place in Cuba. That in Cuba we have exterminated gambling and administrative corruption. That there is a complete freedom and there are no crimes. That in Cuba there is a better standard of living. No questions about the agrarian reform taking place to give the people of the country a better life. None of these questions has been asked because all the interview was about negative questions.
From one end of Cuba to the other, the communist infiltration is spreading, not in numbers so much as in strategic jobs. Cuba's situation perhaps can best be compared to a clean atomic bomb. The government, as in the past, is not for sale, but the explosion may again erupt at any moment. Elections are no longer discussed in Cuba. Castro is too busy with the agrarian reform on which he has staked his country's future. There appears to be no evidence that Castro's guerrilla forces will soon give way to normal military functions. What does the church think in this predominantly Catholic country? Officially, little. Individually, they favor land reforms, but at least one priest has openly recognized the Red Menace. With the loss of former Prime Minister Mira Corona, the last Castro link with the conservative Cubans, U.S.-Cuban relations will be hard put to cement. Cuba's future? Castro's opposition is mobilizing in the mountains of Cuba and outside her borders, and we're already seeing more bloodshed. How can Castro solve some of his problems? Certainly not by importing 500,000 peasants to Havana to prove their loyalty. These films just in from Havana emphasize Castro's claim of popular support, but one wonders whether Castro might not accomplish more if the people were back on the farms working to build Cuba. Could not the $200,000 raised for another Castro talkathon have been put to better use? The food, clothing, and farm implements could have been distributed at the source of the need. Whatever else Castro has or hasn't given the people, there's no question that he has given them a sense of freedom. And for the moment anyway, the Cuban looks hopefully, perhaps even confidently to the future. For a direct report on the farmers' concentration, we switch to Havana and WCKT's Dick Lobo.
Today, Julio 26 in Havana has been an historic day and a happy one for the more than 2 million residents and campesinos that have gathered to pay homage to the illustrious leader of their revolution, Dr. Fidel Castro possession, their machetes. The day was climaxed when hundreds of thousands gathered at the monstrous civic plaza to hear Fidel speak. The leader of the revolution kept the huge throng waiting more than 5 hours in a boiling sun while he's kept reviewing a parade, sat in a Sherman tank, and appeared...
Heard Dick report, Fidel Castro remains as Prime Minister of Cuba. Nothing could have come as less of a surprise. This is Wayne Ferris for WCKT News.
Outlook, another in a weekly series of in-depth reports on issues and news events of interest to the South Florida community. Tonight, Cuba, the unfinished revolution, an examination of Cuba's political evolution from the conquistadors to Castro. Your reporter, Wayne Ferris.
3 days ago, the government of Fidel Castro celebrated its 5th birthday. Despite economic chaos, diplomatic isolation, continuing political pressure, and counter-revolutionary activity, the dictatorship in Cuba has survived, if it has not prospered. In a moment, we'll retrace the roots of Cuba's continuing revolution. History relates that Christopher Columbus was searching for the fabled land of Cipango when on October 28, 1492, he came upon the island of Cuba. The discoverer of the New World called it the most beautiful land ever beheld by human eyes. The conquistadores who followed Columbus showed little interest in Cuba. For the next 400 years, the pearl of the Antilles remained poor and undeveloped. During the early exploration of the hemisphere, Cuba was merely a watering place for the Spanish Armada, traveling to and from the gold and silver mines of Mexico and Peru. The port of Havana was the center of the New World smuggling operations, and the slave trade pirates found a haven on the Isle of Pines. The British captured Cuba in 1763 and occupied the island for little more than a year before returning it to Spain. It was a turning point, however. From the English, the Cubans learned that prosperity could be had through free trade. Spain made some concessions to the Creoles or native-born Cubans, but generally maintained its control over the island's economy and government. During the 19th century, while the rest of Latin America burned with revolution against Spain, Cuba remained the ever-faithful island. But during the closing days of the 19th century, a poet-patriot named José Martí sparked the flame of independence in Cuba. On October 10th, 1868, a wealthy Creole planter, Carlos Manuel de Cespedes, raised the banner of free Cuba at his sugar mill in Oriente province. 3 bloody wars followed, and with each new Cuban attack, Spain retaliated with greater savagery. By 1898, both Spain and the forces for independence were nearly bankrupt, morally and financially. Then the U.S. battleship Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor. Inflamed by sensational newspaper stories, a war-minded Congress and public opinion demanded revenge. The United States entered the fight against Spain, and after some brief but decisive encounters with the U.S. Navy, Spain surrendered. Theodore Roosevelt, then Undersecretary of the Navy, won fame with his Rough Riders at San Juan Hill. But independence, for which so much blood was shed, evaded the Cuban patriots. Cuba became a protectorate of the U.S. At the peace conference in Paris, Cuban leaders were excluded. General Maximo Gomez, commander of the Cuban forces, was refused permission to parade his troops with American forces in Santiago. Anti-Americanism is a major policy of the Castro regime, one that finds a response among broad segments of the Cuban people. But it was not invented by Castro or the communists. The anti-American trend began after the Spanish-American War, when the U.S. was accused of reneging on a commitment to a free and independent Cuba. From 1898 to 1901, Cuba was governed by 2 American generals. The United States then decided that the island should be free. A constitutional convention was held in Havana. But even as the delegates labored to create an independent nation, Congress moved to retain U.S. influence in Cuba. Senator Orville Platt offered an amendment to a military appropriations bill guaranteeing the right of the U.S. to intervene in Cuban affairs. The Platt Amendment became a symbol of America's brief venture into so-called colonialism until it was repealed in March 1934 by President Franklin Roosevelt. The Constitution writers in Havana accepted the Platt Amendment rather than, as Cuba's General Maximo Gomez put it, bring about a worse catastrophe. The elections that followed saw only one candidate on the ballot. General Bartolome Masso, a hero of the War of Independence, withdrew from the race, charging U.S. authorities with influencing the election. Thomas Estrada Palma, who spent the war years in New York and favored by the U.S., was elected president by default. That same year, Rough Rider Teddy Roosevelt was elected president of the U.S. His opponents claimed that Roosevelt's big stick policy barred development of responsible leadership. In 1906, President Estrada Palma won re-election amid cries of fraud. Soon after, an opposition congressman was murdered in Las Vegas, and the act sparked an armed revolt. President Roosevelt demanded an end to the crisis and threatened armed intervention. William Howard Taft, who would succeed Roosevelt to the presidency, was then Secretary of War. Roosevelt sent him to Havana to settle the situation. President Estrada Palma resigned, and Taft became governor of Cuba.
A few days later, a politically influential lawyer, Charles E. Magoon, replaced Taft as governor. His job was to pacify the country and hold elections. Magoon succeeded by putting opposition leaders on the public payroll. The election of 1908 brought power General Jose Miguel Gomez, the leader of the anti-Palma revolt. He by now established cordial relations with the U.S., but commanded one of the most corrupt regimes in Cuban history. In 1913, Gomez stepped down and General Mario Garcia Menacol became president. His was a reform government which established a national currency and a nationwide sanitation program. General Gomez opposed President Menacol for a second term in 1917. The election was disputed and Gomez launched another revolt. President Woodrow Wilson, deeply involved in World War I, ordered the U.S. Marines at Guantanamo Naval Base to suppress the rebellion. Menacol was restored to the presidency. The sugar market boomed during the First World War, and Cuba prospered. Fortunes were made overnight, and the economy expanded like a balloon. But during the early 20s, the balloon burst. Cuba and Spanish banks failed. Cuba's economy was in ruins. But the Depression in the United States was still some years away, and American capital poured into Cuba. The sugar industry, a staple in the island's economy, was controlled by U.S. interests. The economic collapse cost Menacol the presidency, and he was succeeded in 1921 by Dr. Alfredo Zayas, a former running mate of General Gomez. This was an era of political and civic freedom, but continued corruption. President Warren Harding was in the White House. He became dissatisfied with Dr. Zayas' fiscal policies, and U.S. General Enoch Crowder was dispatched to put Cuba's house in order as a special presidential envoy. With a show of independence, Dr. Zayas refused to be dictated to. He appointed Dr. Jose Manuel Cortina, a widely respected nationalist leader, to handle General Crowder. Dr. Cortina succeeded in getting President Harding to appoint Crowder as ambassador, effectively kicking him upstairs. As the economic situation in Cuba deteriorated, political factions united to choose a leader who would bring about reform. Unemployment stalked the island, and the government was paralyzed with corruption. The economy, or what was left of it, was in the hands of foreign investors. From all this emerged General Gerardo Machado. They called him Caudillo, the leader. During his first 3 years in office, General Machado cracked down on graft, built Cuba's major highway system, enacted tariff laws protecting local industries, and concentrated on needle public works. But Machado was a dictator, and he was Cuba's first. He admired Italy's fascist ruler, Benito Mussolini. During his second term, he managed a change in the Cuban Constitution, extending his term. He retained friendly relations with the United States and President Calvin Coolidge. But within the confines of the University of Havana, resistance was spawning. Strikes and demonstrations were staged. Finally, a student was killed by police, and a war of terror began. By 1933, the brutality of the Machado regime became unbearable. Cubans, even those critical of past intervention, now pleaded for the U.S. to save them from Machado. President Franklin Roosevelt dispatched Ambassador Sumner Welles to mediate the situation, but Machado was immovable. Finally, on August 12, 1933, he fled to Nassau. Cubans celebrated by Fidel Castro was just 7 years old, a child living a peaceful, untroubled life at his father's plantation far from strife-torn Havana. And amid the chaos of 1933, an army sergeant named Fulgencio Batista led a unique military coup, overthrowing his superior officer. The United States was unhappy over the turn of events, but President Roosevelt wanted to establish a good neighbor policy in Latin America and opposed intervention. Those taking part in Batista's coup said the sergeant was a born leader and a person people could trust. In a moment, we'll return to Cuba, the unfinished revolution. To consolidate his power, Fulgencio Batista handpicked a liberal professor and student leader, Dr. Ramon Grau San Martin, as his president. The Grau government forced the U.S.-owned electric company to reduce its rates and passed minimum wage, fair employment, Social Security, child labor, and tariff laws. For the first time, a Cuban president appeared interested in the welfare of Cuba, but Batista had greater ambitions. Batista, now a colonel and undisputed master of Cuba, met with Jefferson Caffrey, President Roosevelt's man in Havana. Grau was forced to resign 4 months after he took the oath of office. During the next 6 years, Batista changed presidents 7 times. The U.S. played an influential role during this period, adding prestige and stability to the Batista regime. The good neighbor policy evolved in Cuba and elsewhere in support of friendly dictators. In 1935, Batista used naked brutality to crush a general strike instigated by liberal groups at the University of Havana. Often during his 25-year career, Batista's response to opposition was swift and savage, earning him the title of the Butcher. But Batista combined force with cunning. Early in his regime, he gained control of Cuba's labor groups. In 1939, when Batista resigned from the army to run for president, he bought off the support of the Communist Party by granting them cabinet posts and handing over control of the newly formed Cuban Workers' Confederation. The following year, a new constitution was drafted, a document that Batista sometimes bypassed, but which became the embodiment of progressive Cuban idealism. From 1940 to 1944, Batista's government was a balance of liberal and conservative thinking. Cuba enjoyed a period of peace and relative freedom, but some army leaders became dissatisfied with Batista's regime and hatched a conspiracy. Batista appealed to the loyalty of his old army cronies, and the conspirators were forced into exile. Batista could not succeed himself for re-election in 1944. The Constitution of 1940 made it illegal. Instead, he promoted a successor, Dr. Carlos Rodriguez. But the people chose Batista's first president, an arch-enemy, Dr. Ramon Grau San Martin. The people wanted a change. Grau won by a landslide, and Batista announced his retirement from politics. For the first time in Cuban history, political stability and the beginning of a democratic constitutional government seemed near at hand. The people were optimistic, and the U.S. washed its hands of Cuban politics. But the Grau regime was a tragic disappointment. The former university professor failed to bring about the expected liberal reforms. His regime fell into the all too familiar political pattern of neglect and corruption. A free-for-all election in 1948 brought Carlos Prio Socrates, Grau's labor minister, to the presidency. Batista, now living in Daytona Beach, won a Senate seat in absentia. During the period of political turmoil, young Fidel Castro was a law student at the University of Havana and a leader of radical student causes. Despite some attempts at reform, the Prio regime was unable to solve Cuba's problems. And like its predecessor, the government suffered from charges of corruption. The middle class, business and professional community was alive with talk of conspiracies. The former dictator Fulgencio Batista came out of retirement to run for the president in 1952, and young Dr. Fidel Castro was a candidate for Congress. But the election of 1952 never came to pass. Candidate Batista was running a poor third. The Orthodox Party, under which banner Castro ran, was doing well. The atmosphere was heavy with impending crisis. On March 9th, Batista led a surprise army coup that overthrew the government 3 months before the scheduled balloting. President Prio fled to Mexico. Batista had crushed a freely elected government and the hopes of stability and reform. The moderation of Batista's first regime 8 years before gave way to a heavy-handed dictatorship. Batista dissolved Cuba's Congress and suspended the Constitution. Corruption was unchecked. Fidel Castro, robbed of a chance for public office, joined the anti-Batista underground. Castro struck his first blow on the 26th of July, 1953. With a ragtail band of less than 200 followers, Fidel and his brother Raul staged an abortive attack on Moncada Army Barracks in Santiago. It won Castro a 15-year prison sentence and a new reputation. At his trial, Castro made his memorable "History Will Absolve Me" speech, in which he gave expression to the ideals of freedom and justice that have long inspired the Cuban people. In it, he demanded an absolute guarantee of freedom of the press and political action. He spoke of free elections as a prime duty of government and promised land reform that would give Cuba's sharecropping peasants their own homesteads. Castro's speech was his manifesto, the goals of the revolution he would lead. He described himself as a humanist, promising bread with freedom and without fear. Batista, meanwhile, staged an election in 1954 in which he was the only candidate. The others withdrew. To celebrate his hollow victory, the dictator declared a general amnesty, and Castro was released from prison 22 months later. Batista needed the election in 1954 to add an air of legality to his regime. But the opposition, which by now spread through all segments of Cuban society, was not appeased. Early in 1956, the dictator outlawed the communists. His secret police attempted to link Castro with the Reds, but until late in 1958, the old-line communists opposed Castro. Shortly after Castro's release from prison, he went to Mexico, where he put together a band of 82 dedicated followers. In December 1956, Castro and his men landed at Oriente Province, where they clashed with Batista soldiers. A dozen survived to escape to the mountains, including Fidel, his brother Raul, and Ernesto Che Guevara. Batista, however, proclaimed Castro's death and the end of the revolution. But 3 months later, a well-organized band of insurgents led by the president of Havana University's Student Federation attacked the presidential palace in Havana. Some people believe the United States might have exercised more positive influence over Cuban politics during the 50s, when Batista seized power. In 1952, President Harry Truman routinely extended U.S. recognition. U.S. Ambassador Arthur Gardner, appointed by President Eisenhower, did not hide his friendship for the dictator, and Batista made much of it. Gardner was replaced by Earl E.T. Smith during the Eisenhower administration. A wealthy businessman and finance chairman of the Republican Party in Florida, Smith called Castro a ruffian and a bandit. By this time, however, Castro was the symbol of a nationwide rebellion. Minor military revolts occurred, and Batista's support among the middle and upper classes had all but evaporated. The dictator's ground was eroding, but U.S. policy failed to adjust accordingly. Castro was now firmly entrenched in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. There were other rebel groups, such as the Second Front of Escambray, but they had no leader with Castro's magic. Castro's rebel band had one advantage: the impregnable fortress of the mountains. Che Guevara, a brilliant Argentine communist and master of guerrilla warfare, directed, along with Fidel himself, a campaign of hit-run terrorism against Batista's army. In March 1958, the U.S. canceled further shipments to Batista. On the 9th of April, Castro again took the offensive. He called for a general strike. Competing revolutionary groups deliberately ignored the call, however, and the communists cunningly condemned it. The unsuccessful strike prompted Castro to intensify his terrorist tactics, goading. The November elections were held as scheduled, with the inevitable result: the Batista candidate was elected. Cuba was virtually at war with itself. Even the church was against Batista, and the murder of several priests was attributed to the dictator's secret police. The island's economy was sinking under the weight of prolonged crisis. Finally, the United States struck the death blow. Ambassador Smith went to the presidential palace in December and told Batista this country would withdraw recognition of the Batista regime. Batista could not survive without U.S. support. A close associate of the dictator met with Castro in the hills. At a New Year's Eve party at Camp Columbia, Batista announced that he would step down to avoid further bloodshed. That same night, Batista and his family fled to the Dominican Republic. Cuba belonged to Fidel Castro. We'll be back in a moment with the outlook for Cuba, the unfinished revolution. An observer of the French Revolution 2 centuries ago noted that when you undertake to run a revolution, the difficulty is not to make it go, it's to hold it in check. Perhaps this happened in Cuba. Opinion is divided as to whether Fidel Castro was a confirmed communist when he went into the mountains. Some argue that near the end of the Batista regime, the bearded leader was convinced that he needed the communists to succeed. His choice, whenever it was made, robbed the revolution of its validity as well as its believed democratic origin. Fidel Castro is the master of Cuba today and a dangerous catalyst of revolutionary fervor throughout the hemisphere. But Castro is not an orthodox disciple of Marx and Lenin. His brand of communism is often as vexatious to Moscow as it is to Washington. Castro could easily have become the hero of the free world. Perhaps U.S. errors in Cuban politics set the stage. For example, perhaps if the United States had not recognized the Batista coup in 1952, the chain of constitutional government might not have been broken. But history cannot be reconstructed on the basis of what might have happened or what might have been. Our own State Department was not slow in recognizing this. In an official white paper on Cuba in 1961, our government described the Batista regime as an open invitation to revolution, adding, "We acknowledge past omissions and errors in our relationships with the Cuban people." The Cuban Revolution began 100 years ago. It's still going on. It must, if we and the other people of this hemisphere are to come through this troubled age with our freedom and sovereignty intact. This is Wayne Ferris for Outlook. Good night.
You've been watching Cuba, the Unfinished Revolution on Outlook, a weekly presentation of WCKT News. Next week at 6:30, Outlook will present another report of interest to the South Florida community. This program was pre-recorded. WCKT invites your comments upon this program and your views as to how we can otherwise serve you through television.